Hi, Emily.
Hi Lucy, how are you?
I'm good. I've been busy. How are you?
Yes, also busy, school holidays, so it's busy, busy. It's good.
Woohoo! This is our first review podcast of this season. Dan is too busy to join us, everybody. So if you're used to hearing Dan, Emily, and I do some reviews, he is way too cool for school right now.
Hopefully for the next one, we'll get him back.
Yeah. So this review was suggested by yourself, Emily. So it's Not Yet Dark, which is a 2017 documentary. It's narrated by Colin Farrell, and the little blurb is an Irish filmmaker refuses to let a diagnosis of motor neuron disease stop him from directing a feature film, using only his eyes to communicate via a computer, and it centers around Simon Fitzmaurice and Ruth O'Neill Fitzmaurice. I believe the book that it's based on was written by Ruth, was it?
No, I think it was written by him, so that she has written a book as
Oh,
well. So he wrote a book called, I think it's called It's Not Yet Dark, or maybe just Not Yet Dark. And then I feel like she released the book sort of from her side of the story a couple of years later.
that might be what I'm getting confused with.
Yeah.
I was looking it up actually and thinking it would be great to reach out out to her, wouldn't it? Because I have to say, thank you for such a great recommendation.
No, you're welcome. It wasn't something I'd seen, but reading sort of read the blurb that you've just read out and then looked into it a bit more. And I think because Colin Farrell done the narration, it came up through some film searches that I was doing, and that's why it popped up in the first place. Yeah, so I hadn't when I recommended it, I hadn't seen it, but it was yeah, it's just a beautiful film.
It really, really was. I just found myself writing it verbatim. It was like, rather than
Yes.
writing notes about it, I was just writing everything Simon says through the voice of Colin Farrell in it, because what a what a poet he was.
Definitely. And in some ways the language it's quite minimalist. And I don't mean that it's not rich language because it is, but I think in terms of like it's quite short sentences, but that lends itself really well to being so somehow it's very descriptive despite the fact it's so minimalist. So it's beautiful.
Yeah. So the documentary opens, and at this point when it's being made, Simon can no longer speak. So it's narrated by Colin Farrell, and and it opens, and there it's a gentleman and a woman who are near the coast somewhere on a very grey looking day, and the gentleman is in a wheelchair being pushed, covered in blankets, is not moving at all. It doesn't really have any sort of facial expression on, but the lady is sort of walking, pushing the wheelchair, I believe,
Yes.
and she's sort of accompanying him, sometimes talking to him, and there's this really his voiceover is really powerful, and from that moment, just those few first seconds in, I just thought this is going to be brilliant. But it said, "What is man? I had a different life before this one, before death stood beside me. My death. How much can be taken away and what is left?"
And that's how it begins. And yeah, wow.
Yeah. So, what were your thoughts at the beginning, or what do you want to share?
I think at the beginning, I think if I'm being honest, I was slightly, although I suggested it, I was slightly nervous to watch it. I think because of the topic, and I knew it was about motor neurone disease, and obviously that diagnosis has, it's finite. People who get that diagnosis know that it's a life limiting condition, and I think because of that, I suppose I was worried. I don't know why I was worried that it would be very upsetting,
Mm,
and actually, as soon as it opened with that, it all obviously yes, you can see that Simon has this health condition, but it's that love story between him and his wife, and there was a positivity from the very beginning,
mm,
and all that, and then their story starts to come through, and all the joy with that as well. So yeah, it kind of, as soon as I was very into it. As soon as that first scene happened, I was hooked and couldn't stop
Yeah.
watching it.
I agree around that when you see that first scene and there are words that people use for people who cannot move and cannot seem to do the things that we think of as human. And seem is important because we'll find out exactly what Simon at that point in his life was capable of, and it was a lot. So it was quite an almost haunting start, but then really I felt like this is one of the few expressions in film or documentary that can, while there is grief and pain, there is so much joy, but not just, because we're just together, but accomplishment. What Simon accomplishes and his family, what they accomplish. So it's not kind of one of those, wasn't just one of those sort of sob stories.
Yeah.
I really don't mean that in a mean way, but that thing about there's quite a culture for when people have disabilities or lifelong conditions, they're only represented in a sob story type thing. This definitely wasn't that. It was challenging and fascinating, really.
Yeah, and I think it's it challenges the viewer as well, because I guess we do have these sort of expectations of like maybe what being disabled looks like, or the things that somebody can do because of
Yeah.
our interpretation of that. And as you watch through the film, you find all of your expectations being completely challenged. And I think it's a good
Yeah.
thing. It's a great thing.
I think even in a world of rare disease where you do get quite used to, having your normal expectations that you might have started life with being challenged fairly frequently, even in that kind of field, I think what Simon and those around him achieve in this is beyond that. That's not where I realized this was going. I think what you say is a bit like he's talking about his motor neuron disease, how much can be taken away and what is left. And we could get onto some themes later, but I think one of the themes that he brings up regularly, what is it to be human? What is it to be alive? And that first scene, do people leave that documentary feeling the same way leaving it as they do going in? So if you went to watch that film documentary again, how would you feel about Simon in that first scene watching it for the second time?
That's a good question. Yeah, probably quite different. And actually, I did go back and watch it a second time because I wanted to get a better sense of the timeline, and also the film that he was making as well. So yes, I think it did have a different impact the second time because I knew all the things that he was going to go on to accomplish. It didn't feel like, because I think that kind of diagnosis, and especially seeing him in those images at the beginning, there was almost a finality to it. And then you get shown all this creative output, that all
Yes.
these things that he put
Yeah.
into the world in terms of his, obviously his creative output in his film, but then also his family as well. So it's
Yes,
amazing.
exactly. You think you're on a well-known trajectory of
Yes.
deterioration followed by death, and then no, that's not it. And Simon showed that so brilliantly through his art. He was always an artist, though, in some form or another. I did like they brought the whole cast on. I won't upset everyone with a dodgy Irish accent, but his dad comes in, Damien, and says he was a little shite. Which was hilarious because if I wrote it down, his mum brief like came on afterwards. I can't remember what she said, and she basically was like, "Oh, he was a complete darling." Like, but he'd been interested in poetry as a young man. He was interested in poetry. He was writing short fiction from a young age, he grew up with two sisters, and they described him as having humor and sensitivity, and yeah, so he was always a creative person. And I'm sorry to say, I mean, I'm just not that cultural, but he'd even, his short film that he released, his first one, looked brilliant.
Yeah, it did. And I think, and that went on to win some prizes, I think, which I don't know
Yeah.
how normal that is for a student film, but I'm guessing not that usual. So it was obviously highly regarded, even at that stage of his career, quite early on.
Yeah, that's it. It was called Full Circle. I guess it's probably available on YouTube. And yeah, he did. I think it was that he went to they filmed at the New York NYU Film School or something, and he did that, and then he had another film come out, and that went to the Sundance Film Festival. That was called
Yes.
Sound of People.
Yeah. So already, as I say, it's obviously a career trajectory kind of going upwards. It
Yeah,
felt like.
yeah, and in a way, it kind of it's slightly different because there were bits where I thought, not to directly compare, there were bits in it where I thought this is where, for me, Bombardier Blood was sort of needed more depth, because it's interesting because in Bombardier Blood, obviously, what's his name? Is it Nick? Oh,
The main guy in it,
yeah,
Chris.
Chris, that's it. He has haemophilia, so he has it when he's young. So growing up with that, and those in those difficult challenges. But again, there was that sense of he was always on this trajectory of doing out of the ordinary things. It is not ordinary to become a semi-pro baseball player and carry on going up the ranks.
Yes.
It's not ordered. Not everyone has a film premiered at the like Sundance Film Festival. And but this was a trajectory he was on, and obviously, like Chris, who had his wife who was completely dedicated to him, Simon meets Ruth.
Yes. And then that incredible, I mean, it sort of played out like a proper love story. There was a bit around, I think they knew each other sort of not that well or something.
Yes,
And then
yeah,
later on he saw her on the street and ran after her and they swapped numbers. I think
yeah,
that was that
that's
the
it.
story.
That's it.
And it was like it's like
Yeah.
a rom-com, isn't it? So you had that lovely beginning to their story together.
And he proposed to her at the top of the Empire State Building, which is
Yes.
obviously very sleepless in Seattle.
Very, yeah.
Very sleep. And he went on a Himalayan expedition.
Yes, he did. That's right. I forgot. Yes, he did go on a Himalaya, and then somebody said, "Oh, would you ever do that again?" And he said, "No." So
Yeah, I thought that was brilliant. So he decided to. So this was before he had any signs and symptoms of his condition at this point, I believe. And he decided to go on a Himalayan expedition. And there was this one point where he goes, "I freeze. What am I doing here?" And he was talking about, the sheerness of the cliffs and everything. And he goes, "If I fall here, I fall to my death." And when he describes it in the film, you really get the sense of he truly felt like he was having a near death experience. He wasn't falling, but he could anticipate it. So yeah, so just very interesting that those overlaps. And it made me think about, I think he says, "A love will get you through." And both of those people that we're talking about, you know, they both have such strong familial community and a really loving partner.
yeah, I think that definitely came through, and I think the partnership between him and Ruth, that's obviously it's a theme throughout the whole documentary, and obviously their life together changes significantly as his illness progresses, but you get that sense that something in that partnership stayed the same throughout, despite those challenges, which again is incredible.
Yeah, it was like a tangible thing, but it also wasn't one way.
No.
Simon was constantly thinking about Ruth. It wasn't the we need to support Simon as much as possible. You know, Simon was seemed, well, to me, he was as dedicated a father and husband before, you know, when he was really very disabled as he was beforehand.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting when obviously when he gets the diagnosis and he
Mm,
describes that process and the that he's in shock. But it's really interesting because he sort of says, I can't remember what he says about himself, but then he says Ruth starts to cry. As
okay.
in that,
Yeah.
yeah, so her that and that was really interesting that obviously he was sort of saying the difference in their reactions. But
Mm,
even at that moment when obviously you're probably wrapped up in having this, huge impact diagnosis, he was very aware of her reaction to that too
yeah.
at the same time.
Yeah, because he started having if I recall correctly, he started sort of having a weak dragging leg, I believe. And I think he was away at the time, and he kind of like I think he was away, and then he was saying where this was the Sundance Film Festival, and he said this is what he wondered whether this is when the MND really kicked in, and the sadness of, you know, that's lifeless of it was that it's like he said it's like, you know, he'd done it, he'd got to the Sundance Film Festival, it's like he'd been holding his breath and he finally let go, and that's when his body starts showing up the symptoms for MMD. I wrote I wrote the date that, so it was 2008. They had two young boys at the time, and I thought that maybe we should just ask permission to use this part of the film in all activity we do in teaching from now on about what it's like to receive a diagnosis, because I thought it was such a stunning, and I don't know, I found it really powerful how he talked about it. And he said, light leaves the room, and air and sound and time, 3 to 4 years to live. I don't hear him. Is this my life? Is this my route? Is this my life? Is this me? And then but it sounds like he was on his own with the doctor,
Yes.
his father-in-law and his wife Ruth outside. They come into the room. He tells them the same thing. So the doctor tells them, I don't hear him. Ruth starts to cry. Within 10 minutes, we're out on the street, not knowing what to do. We do what we planned before. We go to lunch. We walk through the streets like survivors of some vast impact, pale, powdered ghosts. Ruth is pregnant with our third child. I call my parents. It is the worst phone call of my life.
Yeah. It doesn't feel like the most supported environment to receive that. You shouldn't be out on the street within 10 minutes of hearing something like that.
And I think you know, I really get everyone listening to actually watch this documentary, because the way they show it as well, it's like, I just think you can really feel that feeling of you've been put out in the cold. And yeah, it was a, I thought just one of those moments you can learn so much without having to be directly told what and what not to do.
Yes.
Yeah. He says, I also on that, he then says, the children live in the moment, so they get on with the day, go to bed and cry at night, soaking them up for as long as he could. My God.
I know. But it is like that when you have children. And I think that's a theme, again, that's another theme throughout that the children are distraction's the wrong word, but because you have to be so
Yeah,
present with them, there's not that sense of even like week to week with a young child. You're just there in the moment with them doing something right now. And actually, again, that's something that they talk, both him and Ruth talk about, I think, through the film, that they're just there with their kids and it's just taking it every day at a time.
yeah. And then this is my last one that I definitely will get Helen to put into our Rare Disease 101 training because Ruth says when you're diagnosed, it's like a nuclear blast, but then the process from the initial shock, that's the real journey.
Yeah.
These people are like, can they just cut, Ruth, come and do our job, please?
Yeah. Can they just come and write it all
Could
for
you
you?
just come and do Rare Disease 101 training for us because we are not needed. So,
But this is great. This is what this podcast is for, because then again, it's recommending further resources, isn't it? So there you
oh,
go.
that's true. That's true. So, what else did we sort of learn or
I think I'm trying to think again. What amazed me is that obviously, so they talk about that diagnosis and the impact of that, and then I don't know. I feel like if it was me, my life would just stop, and then I wouldn't know what to do. But they just kept moving forwards, and they talked about they went on a trip to Australia as a family. I think that was one
yes,
of the next things, and I think they planned to go. I want to say they planned to go for 6 weeks, and then he says we ended up staying for 6 months.
yes,
And again, the footage of that time, the way he talks about it, or the way that Colin Farrell narrates that bit, it sounds like such a joyous time that they had, despite the fact that his condition was clearly progressing at that point. They managed to do an awful lot of things when they were in Australia as a family.
yeah. I loved because I think Ruth said we were all just going to go mad and get depressed at home at that point where Simon was. I don't know if he was able to work or had been set up to work at that point and was needing sort of more support. And but they go with three young children, and I just thought that was awesome. Just kind of I know I wrote some like loads. I just thought how brave.
Yeah,
You know, you have to really like obviously, it sounds like, it sounds fun going to Australia, but I mean, who do I know who's got three young children who are going to take them to Australia on a holiday, right? Let alone when one of you is ill, and I'm sure they would have been worried about if he got ill, if he was, got seriously ill while out there, not being with his parents and his sisters and everything. So I think that's a really big deal to do anyway. And I love that Ruth's just so like it was Ruth's idea. She's like, we're gonna do this. He says it's one of the best times of our life and it changes everything. We are happy. And I love this. He swam in the pool and he could move more. And in the pool he could be, he could be more himself because it allowed him that movement. It's just such an important reminder of there are ways that we can help simulate your normal experience if you lose that. Or I think, I lived near a lake during my pregnancy, and when I was really heavily pregnant, and you go and just get in the lake and you feel like yourself again for a bit.
yeah. It feels nice. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it was amazing. I thought all the footage of them, there was footage of them in a pool, and I feel like in the sea maybe as well in Australia. And they all looked so happy, and obviously the kids were loving it. And what an adventure! They went and had an adventure.
Yeah, yeah. I thought what, and also like showing your children that you can go and still do joyous things and things. I know that you have to have a certain. I think they had friends in Australia, so that obviously
They
really
did.
helped to go visit friends. But Yeah, I love that bit. Actually, I think that's just really what the whole thing is like. It's like, oh, this is going to be difficult, and then they do something really cool.
They do it anyway. Yeah.
I mean, it starts to get really worrying because Simon went into respiratory failure in, I think that was in 20, just before 2011, maybe 2010. So he goes into respiratory failure, and which happens as the condition starts, paralyzing your respiratory center and all of the things, all of the muscles and things that need to keep going to keep you breathing. And he says it came way earlier than expected. So, getting respiratory failure, having a pneumonia, being on a ventilator, these are things that are expected in when someone has deterioration from this condition. He ended up being intubated in an emergency situation. So people with MND might be intubated but not in emergency, whereas he went into a respiratory failure. It wasn't expected, and he had a pneumonia, and he's there in hospital, like I think not long back from Australia, is it?
No, I feel I can't remember the time. I don't know when they came back, but I'm sure it's something about in the September that year, they
Yeah.
said. And they were definitely in Australia over Christmas. So I feel like they were back for a bit. And then this is what happened.
And so now he's gone from that to now he's laid up in an ITU on a ventilator. And I didn't quite get what was being suggested at the time, but then it becomes clear that basically that the doctor was suggesting after not that long that Simon should be taken off the ventilator and left to die. And I was surprised. I just have to say, obviously I wasn't there and I'm not commenting on this as a doctor, but it seemed such a fast move to me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not from a medical background, so I don't know what the protocol, it's a horrible word, but I don't know sort of what that looks like. But given all the things that he was doing up until that point, it's again to me it seemed surprising, and obviously that becomes clear that's not something he very strongly doesn't want that, and also his family really rally around him at that point to say literally speak for him when he can't, to say no, that's not what Simon wants. We want to get him out of here as quickly as possible. How can we make that happen? That's the questions they're asking.
Yeah. And they do really with passion recall basically having to fight to say no, Simon wouldn't want this. Simon would want as much time as possible with his children. And Ruth said at one point, I don't want to know the cost of keeping Simon alive. I just want to keep Simon alive. And yeah, it was just sort of, I found that quite a shock. I think it's quite nerve-wracking, isn't it, as well, that idea that you're like, that feels like quite a quick decision. Hopefully it wouldn't happen like that now. Really, someone should have advanced care planning if they have a life-limiting condition. And it sounds like this was the first time he'd ever had been in this situation. So it would be interesting to know. But either way, it shouldn't really come if someone has a life limiting condition. I just don't believe it should come as a completely out of the blue concept at the point when someone is saying to them, your loved one might not survive this, and we're going to actively remove things that are keeping him alive, because those conversations need to be had, and you have to make sure that that is what Simon would want, and etc etc. There is frameworks within which to do this. And so they did the tracheotomy, and then it sounds like they fought very hard to get him out of
Yes.
hospital as soon as that was possible. Yeah, I and then you get to watch him having recovered be at home playing around with his boys again. Yeah, he's got a tracheotomy, but he's playing with his boys.
Yeah, and again, and he references sort of I think the relationship between him and Ruth at this point as well, because he's there's a quote where he says it's not about how long you live, but about how you live. And then he cites that scene in The Princess Bride where they're saying what's keeping you alive, and it's true. It says true love, and again he brings it back to him and Ruth that him and Ruth and also the whole family. That's his reason for keeping going. And like you say, and then you see that shot of them playing, and you think, yes, of course.
Yeah,
Thank goodness, the worst didn't happen at that point.
yeah, because those are, and especially when you've got small children, those are years where every year that that child has with that brain development, with their father present, who is a loving father and cares for them, it's their right to have that parent around if they can. And our like society's perception of what is a life or what is value is, that it's so unique really to everyone that those decisions have to be made individually, carefully, with as much in advance as possible for what someone would want to do if they cannot express what they would like. But his family knew very well that Simon would want to be with his boys for as long as possible, and it paid off. And in a surprising, I'm going to say it, in a surprising turn of events, they then had two other babies.
He did. So not only, creative output, also family output after
Yeah.
more joy, more joy.
Creative output. It can be offspring, it can be
Yeah.
like could be films. But yeah, they had two other babies.
Twins, we should say.
Twins, that's
Twins.
it.
Yes.
Twins.
Yes.
Yes, that's the
Twins.
word for two babies that come out.
At the same time. Yeah. But no,
I'm
amazing.
a bit allergic to the term because my brother had twins. It was quite stressful.
Oh, okay. Fair enough. But he says it there again. I think he says something like, I've got it written down, my babies, they are life, is
Yeah.
what he says about the twins. So,
I mean, I think probably I was in love with Simon by this point.
yeah.
Sorry, Ruth. But
I know. It's just the writing is so brilliant that all the obviously it's not him speaking, but it's his words.
yeah. I mean,
And
I know my husband does love me. I'm just questioning whether he loves me like Simon loved Ruth.
should we put together a quiz of some kind?
Yeah, exactly. But really wonderful. And yeah, they are my life. They are life. Sadie and Hunter,
Yes.
I believe.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Um, and yeah, Ruth saying, take it day by day and celebrate the little achievements. Anything is possible. Yeah, it was so beautiful. And then
And then it all starts, creatively, it all starts again and he goes on to do even more. So
yeah, because I think at one point Ruth was really doing most of his care, wasn't she?
yes.
I know there was a point where they got more care in for him. She talked about being able to get back to being a wife and mother and have those boundaries. And kudos, if you can get that care, I just think it's so important to try and stay in the roles that you are, that you had defined for yourself, because it's hard to play multiple roles in intimate relationships.
Yeah, and with them being a parent as well and having that parental role and yeah, you having the extra additional care to deal with as well. So yeah, that was definitely they talked about that and that was obviously a significant point for them that she could focus then on their relationship
Yeah.
and the children.
Yeah. And then, just to add in some really cool technology, the eye gaze computer. So an OT, so woohoo, occupational therapist,
Yeah.
suggested and got in touch with a charity, woohoo, charities, to get Simon an eye gaze computer. So people might have seen this, which is where you use your eye gaze, like where your eyes are moving, to indicate letters and words to be able to communicate. And he started doing what he wanted to do, which was to get back to filmmaking. So he started drawing storyboards with his eyes. I think it also required like really, really small movements with the thumb as well. So
Yeah, he said something like that the technology, I think, for the eye gaze in terms of producing text was okay because you can point it at the words or at the letters. But I think, I mean, maybe it changed, but perhaps there's better technology now or even than
yes,
he had.
yeah.
But I think the drawing, he said the drawing software wasn't really up to scratch in terms of the eye gaze. So I think he still had use of his thumb at
Oh
that
yeah,
point.
okay. So
So
it's
he could storyboard all the scenes for his film, and most of those were done. I mean, still with a thumb. I mean, I'd struggle with a pencil to be honest, but just
this is
I
the
feel a
whole point,
failure.
isn't it? It's like this guy could storyboard full stop.
Yeah.
And then he could do it with the tiny movement of his thumb. Thank goodness his family were there and supported for him to be able to keep producing his art. He said he could communicate with his family and friends and then went back to being funny and doing a job. So like, that kind of being not just communicating like I need this, etc. There's that kind of exchange of information, but there's just communication of just being able to be funny, but then also it gave him that key to get back to work.
Yeah. And he wrote, and I think he finished, obviously, so the book that the film is, a lot of the words are read, I think, from the book. He wrote that. And then, as you say, I think the script for the film, I think he started that when he could still
Yes,
type, I
yeah,
think, and then obviously finished it off with the eye gaze technology on his new computer. So that was a project that obviously gone on for a long time. But yeah, thank goodness that he had a way of completing it. Otherwise, it'd be unfinished.
yeah, and we wouldn't be here talking about it. Having just I'm so grateful that we got to learn from that you get what that they shared that we get to have that insight, and it's like such a close insight into their lives. It's just very generous to do as well. And then they had the problem of it wasn't the computer could talk, couldn't it? It's a bit like,
Yes.
yeah, but it was, I think she says they called it the American because it had like a that standard robotic American accent.
Yeah.
They said they got used to it because they tried to get in like I tried to make a superficial version, like an whatever, like an, I guess we'd call it AI, but whatever, regenerated version of his voice, but it didn't sound similar. They should have just got Colin Farrell on contract.
Probably. I think with those things, I think it's the inflection, isn't it? Because it's like
Yeah.
when you obviously the computer doesn't know what order you're going to use the words in. So obviously I assume you'd record they didn't they get a combination of his voice from recordings and his dad's voice, and they tried to
Well, that's
merge it, I think, but they said it just sounded weird because it was sort of like him, but not. So they in the
it's
end, I
like
think,
that. It's like Uncanny Valley.
yes, yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
And Ruth said, no, let's just go back to the American because she said
yeah,
it became, I think she said it became part of his fabric in the
yeah.
end. That was like the next, that was just
Yeah,
him.
that's just the
Yeah.
next presentation of him. Yeah, I found that this is what you're right that he started it beforehand, and Ruth had asked him to write "It's Not Yet Dark" because she'd asked him to write letters to his children about memories and how he felt about them, and he says the book is a letter to each of my children. I mean, I think there's people, I definitely know it's true. There are people with parents, both parents who are still alive, who have never been expressed this much love. Do you know what I mean? I
Yeah.
just think it's how, oh gosh, both my parents are gone. I understand there's not, it's not the same as having someone there, but when you can so tangibly know that that person who's gone, how deeply they loved you and cared for you, I think yeah, that must be a nice thing to have, to say the least. Well, Emily, thank you for the recommendation. And everyone, make sure you grab the book and watch the documentary. Maybe we'll make it mandatory training or something. I would really like anyone who is in government making laws about disability and back to work and things like that. That would be good to watch it. Right, well, thank you for your time.
No, thank you. Nice to speak to you. And yeah, look
Yeah, and
forward to hearing the
anyone
podcast.
listening, let us know what your thoughts are. You can always email hello@m4rd.org with the number four. Also, make sure you rate, review, subscribe, and all of those things so that we can get this message out to people. Right, we'll see you next time.
Thanks.